There are some people who like their Halo missions long, there are some people who like their Halo missions hard, and there are others who like their Halo missions long and hard. If you're one of them, then the level Gravemind in Halo 2 might just be your idea of perfection. It is a meat grinder which never slows down for a second, and while it may perhaps last a little too long, for many it will be worth it due to the incredible amount of story it manages to pack into its runtime, and I reckon we should take a closer look at it. Before we get this show on the road proper, here's a quick recap of what happened previously on Halo 2. With Installation 04 in ruins following the events of Halo Combat Evolved, the elite named Thelvadam is branded by the Covenant's leaders, the Prophets, for his costly mistakes. Master Chief, however, is having a much better time on Cairo Station as he collects his new armour and attends an award ceremony before the celebration comes to an abrupt end as the Covenant begins their attack on Earth. After destroying a number of Covenant ships, Chief and Cortana help humanity stave off the Prophet of Regret's fleet, and the Hierarch is soon forced to flee, with Master Chief, Cortana, Miranda Keyes and Johnson following hot on his tail. Meanwhile, Thelvadam is given the title of the Arbiter by the Prophets and is sent on his first mission to quell an insurrection. Not only does he manage to do just that, but Brute Chieftain Tartarus also manages to get his hands on a very familiar face in the process as he captures the former monitor of Installation 04, 343 Guilty Spark. It turns out that Regret led Master Chief and companions straight to another Halo, Installation 05, and so Chief and a group of ODSTs touch down on the planet and begin the hunt for Regret, locating him not long after and eliminating him once and for all. However, it's not all good news, as Master Chief is left with no choice but to jump into a nearby lake to escape the Covenant, at which point he's dragged into the murky depths by an unknown creature. Back on High Charity following Regret's assassination, the Prophets declare the elites to be failures and make the Brutes their protectors instead, which causes quite a bit of tension between the two factions. Guilty Spark also reveals that an activation index is needed to light the ring, and so the Prophets task the Arbiter with fighting through hordes of Flood in order to collect the index from Installation 05's library. Reaching his destination, the Arbiter discovers that Keyes and Johnson have beat him to it, and as he battles to secure control of the artifact, Tartarus enters the fray and promptly betrays him, revealing that the Prophets ordered his demise before he kicks the Arbiter off a platform, seemingly to his death. And now, with two cliffhangers needing to be resolved, let's jump straight into Gravemind. As the mission begins, you might be wondering what the word Gravemind means or what a Gravemind is, and it takes mere moments for your questions to be answered as a horrifying creature reveals itself.
Relax. I'd rather not piss this thing off.
Demon. This one is machine and nerve, and has its mind concluded. This one is but flesh and faith, and is the more deluded.
This cutscene is, for me, the best in the entire Halo series, the moment where the figureheads of each of the game's three major factions finally meet for the very first time. The dialogue during this section is absolutely brilliant. Master Chief and the Arbiter's lines are both pitch perfect for their characters, and I remain convinced to this day that the Gravemind is one of the best written monsters in any video game ever. His dialogue, so poetic and rather beautiful in its structure, is juxtaposed against an ugly mass of tentacles and teeth and death, and he's just such a wonderful creation to listen to and look at. After some back and forth between the Prophet of Regret and 2401 Penitent's Tangent, the Gravemind sends Master Chief and the Arbiter on separate missions to stop the ring being activated. The Arbiter is sent to the control room of Installation 05, while much to the Covenant's surprise, Chief is teleported directly into High Charity.
The great journey is nigh, and nothing, not even the Flood, can stop it.
Boo.
Kill the demon!
I don't want to start the gameplay portion of this video off on the wrong foot by being something of a moaning myrtle, but I've always thoroughly disliked this first room you find yourself in. The scenes immediately before you take control seemingly promise a huge battle with the Covenant straight from the off, and then you end up sort of standing around for quite a while waiting for something to happen. It's a strange decision in terms of pacing, which really sits at odds with what occurs immediately prior, and honestly, I think this room could have been removed altogether and the mission would be all the better for it. I'm sure those who like, or indeed tolerate, playing Gravemind on Legendary would agree with me on this particular point as well, and don't worry, I'll definitely be touching on that side of things a little later in the video. Once the most boring and or frustrating room in the world has been cleared, you put Cortana down on one of the nearby pedestals so she can direct you through High Charity.
That prophet, Truth, he has the index. You've got to take it from him. Let me get these doors. Go. It'll be easier to track Truth if I stay in the network.
This is one aspect of the mission I really enjoy. It's nice to experience Cortana as an almost consistent presence within the environment itself, rather than a disembodied voice in your head, and it obviously makes sense that she guides you, given the location you find yourself in is extremely alien, a point driven home soon after as you step outside and gaze upon the Covenant's capital city in all its glory. Aside from the rather lovely view, most of the opening areas consist of quite straightforward enemy encounters, and I think this is a good time to quickly touch on Halo 2's brutes, as this is the first time in the entire game you actually have to fight them. Halo 2's brutes are a handful. They are extremely durable and easily shrug off attacks from a significant number of weapons, and if you don't think on your feet and come up with a viable strategy sooner rather than later, you might find facing them a real struggle. I've personally always found, surprise surprise, shooting them in the head many times with a weapon like the carbine to be the optimal way of dealing with them, but even then, when there's several of them stomping through an area, that can sometimes be easier said than done. The worst thing that can happen, and it will happen a lot, is that one of them will go berserk and start charging directly at you. Especially on higher difficulties, this can be the kiss of death, and at times they can be incredibly frustrating to deal with. In a mission like Gravemind, which often features cramped hallways and a ridiculous number of enemies, the brutes can be very irritating, but the thing is, I sort of like them that way. Bungie did definitely get a lot of negative feedback regarding Halo 2's brutes, that they were too hard, that they were bullet sponges, that they weren't as fun to fight as the elites, who by the way you never fight again in the entire trilogy after this mission. These are all valid opinions, but it's also a matter of taste, and in a way I despair of what became of the brutes post Halo 2. Whether you like them or not, Halo 2's brutes are unique and felt like a fresh addition to the enemy roster. They take the place of the elites not only in story terms, but also in gameplay, occupying the same spot in enemy groups as their predecessor, but where the elites were a more tactically astute enemy, the brutes, as their name suggests, fight with far less nuance but are much harder to take down to compensate for their lack of tactics. As previously mentioned, whether you actually enjoy taking them on is down to personal preference, however it cannot be argued that they are at least something different. The problem, however, is that following Halo 2, a process I've decided on a whim to call elitification began. Unfortunately, I'd guess due to adverse feedback developer Bungie received post Halo 2's release, by the time Halo 3 rolled around, the brutes seemed to be far closer to elites in brute clothing than they did their Halo 2 incarnations. Bungie, I'd guess, was trying to kill two birds with one stone. They were trying to make the brutes a little less arduous to fight, while also finding a better way to replace the elites, an enemy who had such a huge impact on the franchise, but I can't help but feel like the brutes lost some of their soul in the process. From Halo 3 onwards, they do of course look like brutes, sound like brutes, and sometimes still behave like brutes, but the experience of actually fighting them feels much more like taking on the elites from previous titles, which I think is a great shame. On the plus side, they probably do become a more entertaining enemy to take on the further the series progresses. However, I believe they also lost a good deal of their combat personality in the process. While they may be more fun to fight in later entries, in some ways, I mourn the loss of the Halo 2 style brute. Progressing deeper inside High Charity, Cortana picks up nearby Marine signals.
Wait a minute. I'm reading Marine IFF transponders. The signals are originating somewhere below your position.
and so you head on your merry way to rescue them. Considering the length of the mission, I'm not convinced this section needed to include 3 identical floors for you to explore, and it probably should have been cut down to just the one. You can try and be stealthy when you arrive in the area, which I suppose makes the sequence a little bit different and gives it sort of a jailbreak vibe, but I personally find it incredibly difficult to remain undetected for more than a few seconds, although, as usual, that may be down to my lack of talent rather than an issue with the way the area is designed. Everything in Gravemind up until this point is mostly good but not great, but it's after travelling up the gravity lift and entering the next stage of this mission that things begin to get far more interesting. Entering this next area marks the true beginning of the Great Schism, the Covenant civil war, with Truth's messages about the brute's successes and the failures of the elites marking a huge split in their once unbreakable faction.
The elites have failed to protect the prophets, and in so doing put all our lives at risk. Let no warrior forget his oath. Thou in faith will keep us safe whilst we find the path.
From this point onwards, a whole new dynamic is added to combat. As Master Chief, you fought Covenant and Flood on their own or at the same time on a single battlefield, but discounting the Insurrectionists, the Arbiter encounters earlier in the campaign, this is the first time you've seen Covenant fighting Covenant before, and it's the introduction of this conflict to Gravemind that I think saves the mission from being a pretty underwhelming one. It cannot be denied that the mission suffers from an issue so prevalent in Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 2 in particular, repetition in level design. It's not that any of the areas are badly designed in and of themselves, but nonetheless, no one needs to make their way through the same rooms time and time again. On easier difficulties, it makes the mission feel like it goes on for far too long, and on harder difficulties, that feeling is further intensified due to how unreasonably hard Gravemind is. I thought about playing it through on Legendary for this video, I really did, but I just couldn't put myself through that again. Back in the day, I would play every Halo released through on Legendary by myself, and across all of Bungie's titles, there were only 2 levels which forced me to take an extended break due to just how infuriating I found them. One is Cortana in Halo 3, and the other is Gravemind. You know you're in for a bumpy ride when the mission's very first room is unreasonably difficult to get through, and while there are a few sections throughout the rest of its runtime quite as bad as that, it never really gets that much better. If Bungie had stepped up their editing and had cut down on the 3 or 4 styles of room which are repeated 3 or 4 different times, I'd have much less of a problem with the chaos in terms of difficulty, but they didn't, and to be frank, the level does suffer hugely because of that. As mentioned, however, it's the advent of the Great Schism that saves things, and thinking about it, Gravemind actually does a good job of presenting the best and worst of a lot of Halo 2's missions in one neat package. Yes, it's repetitive as nobody's business, it outstays its welcome by a long way, and at times on higher difficulties, it can feel like a deeply unfair experience. On the other hand, Halo 2's world building and plot is by far the best in the series, rivaled perhaps only by Reach, and Gravemind is one of those missions where those things particularly shine through. The cutscene which kicks off the mission is amazing, watching the Civil War unfold in front of you in a manner which affects gameplay is superb, and the combination of Cortana's commentary and Truth's messages echoing around you is fantastic. During combat, you can get in the middle of things as early or as late as you'd like, and it's a wonderful example of it genuinely feeling like the story is unfolding around you and would continue to unfold whether you were present or not. It really truly feels like you're in the middle of a big, messy conflict in an unfamiliar setting, just trying to muddle your way through as best you can. It soon becomes clear that the events unfolding across High Charity are much more than just a flash in the pan.
The Covenant just destroyed 2 of their own ships, and I'm hearing reports of small arms fire throughout their fleet.
And this realization also marks the appearance of In Amber Clad to further complicate matters.
Slip space rupture. It's in Amber Clad. Hailing. No response.
From this point onwards for a good while, you'll be engaging in encounters with both warring factions, and although the excitement of seeing the Covenant tearing itself apart never really fades, by this point you'll likely have been playing Gravemind for a good 20 to 30 minutes already. With that being the case, I've a few thoughts on how I'd improve the level. Most of them revolve around one thing, getting rid of everything prior to the start of the Great Schism around a third of the way through the mission. The argument, of course, is that those early stages help build atmosphere before the schism occurs, encounters, but I'm not convinced they're really necessary. I wouldn't miss the fairly generic encounters which take place, and the one notable sequence set in the prison could have easily been cut down to a single floor and moved ever so slightly later. In fact, in my mind, it would make the prison an even more interesting experience, as you use the schism to your advantage to sneak past the warring factions no longer guarding the cells, so that you could rescue your allies without being detected. Irrespective of length, I must go on record and say that the final two major encounters are for me the best in the level by far, and help Gravemind end on a massive high note. You first have this conflict on the bridge, where you can pretty much sit back and watch as a huge battle unfolds ahead of you before you have to make your way across it, only to be met by hunters flanked by a huge amount of Covenant. It's chaotic and brutal, and it lends a real sense of scale to proceedings. What follows next is a section I know in my heart of hearts I should dislike intensely. You enter a circular arena where again the Covenant are fighting each other, and quite unexpectedly, an instrumental version of rock band Breaking Benjamin's song Blow Me Away kicks into gear. It is super cheesy. It is super cheesy. I'd imagine it was shoehorned in to get as much use as possible from a song Bungie no doubt spent a lot of money on the rights to, and while the Halo soundtrack does often feature guitars, it definitely does still sound out of place. And you know what? Even so, I bloody love it. Yes, it sticks out like a sore thumb, and if I'd have been a Bungie staffer in the meeting where someone suggested it, I'd have told them it was an incredibly stupid idea, but for whatever reason it works, and it never fails to put a smile on my face, no matter how much or how little I've enjoyed playing through the rest of Gravemind. After receiving some distressing news from Cortana about the contents of In Amber Clad.
This isn't good. I am getting confirmed reports of flood leaving In Amber Clad's wreckage. Let's get the index and find a way out of here, before things get really ugly.
Gravemind draws to a close with another excellent cutscene.
Let him be. The great journey waits for no one, brother. Not even you.
Looking at the anniversary side of things, this is another solid example of how much better Halo 2 was handled compared to Halo Combat Evolved. I do, however, have an issue with the opening cutscene. On the whole, I much prefer the newer version, much like I do with most of the others, but I was a fan of how oppressive the original was due to the darkness which enveloped everything, something that is lost on the Anniversary Edition, which is generally a lot brighter and loses some atmosphere because of that. What doesn't suffer in the atmosphere stakes is High Charity, and the city's new lick of paint really helps it come to life compared to the original. The original still looked pretty good, but the Xbox clearly didn't have the horsepower necessary to really capture its magnificence, and the incredible vistas of the Anniversary Edition make the city feel so much larger and more alive than it did previously. There is an argument I think could be made that the Covenant architecture is perhaps a little too busy in places, but compared to Combat Evolved's hyper-detailed Covenant ships, it is, I think, a relatively minor nitpick. Gravemind is one of those Halo 2 missions I'm really conflicted about, as in some ways it's so very good, and in others it's a bit of a disaster. In terms of story, atmosphere and world building, Bungie does a brilliant job. However, I think it's fair to also say that it's a mission which was in dire need of an editor. At present it goes on far too long and repeats certain areas too many times, and honestly all that was really required was the wholesale removal of a few sections for it to feel like a much more curated, snappy mission. If Bungie hadn't been so rushed during Halo 2's development and had been able to spend a little extra time pruning Gravemind to an adequate length, I wholeheartedly believe that the end result could have potentially been pretty blooming excellent. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you like the cut of my jib and would like to see more, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your feedback, as it all does a great deal to help the channel grow, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.